This is Never Close the Inquiry with Nick Hagan. Welcome to Never Close the Inquiry, where I aim to demystify the right for the left and the left for the right, where if you come as a conservative, I want you to leave knowing a little bit more about liberals. And if you come as a liberal, I want you to leave knowing a little bit more about conservatives, with the whole idea that over time we'll create better conversations, better relationships, better arguments, and maybe 80 or 90 more steps down the road, a better country. Here we are, here with Harry Marino. I've known you for a long time. You are the president of Sports Solidarity. The mission at Sports Solidarity, as I get from the website, is to help athletes, coaches, officials, and other sports industry workers improve their lives through collective action. Okay. Now, there are a lot of reasons that I want to talk to you, just as a friend, but the real reason I want to talk to you, for purposes of this podcast, newsletter, and everything, is to talk about your efforts organizing minor league baseball players, and then kind of, what you've done since then, implications for union organizing as a whole, and yada yada and so forth. So let's
Thanks
go
for
back.
having me. Let me just say that.
Oh yeah,
Thanks for having me on, and it's an honor to be here talking to you about it. I'm glad you asked me to do it.
you are so welcome. Let's go back. Just a minute. I want to get a bit on your background, because you don't just pop into existence organizing minor league baseball players. Like, where are you from? How did you get to that point?
Yeah. So you're right. I did not just pop out organizing minor league baseball players. I, like many American youth, was an avid baseball player and athlete growing up. Right. So dreamed of being a major league player. Grew up in Westfield, New Jersey. And really loved sports my whole life, and was kind of as just a student athlete, right? Like loved
Yeah.
loved school, loved sports. I ended up going to Williams College in Massachusetts to play baseball. So I played baseball and basketball in high school, played baseball in college at D3, good academic school. And really, despite being a pretty good athlete, I hadn't really, before sort of midway through college, really entertained the idea of playing professionally. I kind of matured late in, relatively speaking, grew late and sort of improved velocity late. And so it was, I think, my junior year of college, I got an opportunity to play in the Cape Cod Baseball League in the summer, and that, between my junior and senior year, and that was really the first time that I played in front of professional scouts, and really had the sort of the opportunity to play professional baseball kind of materializing
Yeah,
before
and just
my eyes.
one pause there, for people who aren't familiar with it. Cape Cod, both
Sure.
my cousins played the Cape Cod League. Cape Cod Summer League is probably the most prestigious college summer league in the baseball world. A lot of great players go, invitation only, a lot of scouts at every game, tons of people that played in Cape Cod League have gone on to play in the minors and majors.
Yeah,
Okay,
absolutely
sorry.
true. All
Go.
of that's true. And it was funny because I kind of got, it was like, it's kind of a reach for me to get there. I performed
Yeah,
well in a different summer league the year before, and they brought me in at a temporary contract, and which they do while like other guys play, the College World Series or whatever. And um, you'll appreciate this. Like the first 4 or 5 times out, I just shoved, like didn't give up anything. And so then one guy from the temps could make the full team, and they were like, "All right, Harry, like you've pitched really well. You're going to make the
yeah.
team." I immediately got shelled for the rest of the summer. Of course, right? Like it was like, "Oh, great, super glad we kept him." But lefty. This is more than 10 years ago, 15 years ago at this point. Lefty throwing 90 miles an hour, you have a shot,
Yeah.
right? And so came out of Williams, got basically signed as an undrafted free agent with the Arizona Diamondbacks, and a few days after college graduation went out to play rookie ball for the Arizona Diamondbacks. And so that was really where this whole journey started in a sense, because, you know, I know you played sports and baseball and all growing up, and like most people, I didn't really know what it was to be a minor league baseball player. I just
Right.
assumed it's not as good as being a major league player, but
True.
like it's
Yeah.
it's but whatever, right? Like those guys make a lot of money. I'm sure it's fine. I'm sure it's, you get paid whatever. Um and it is what it is. And I got there, and the first time we got a paycheck, I remember literally saying, like, "Where's the rest of it? Like, is this a joke?" And that was like the first time that I understood. It was like I asked the other guys, I was like, "What's the pay here?" Like, I hadn't even really, known or
Hmm.
paid any attention to it. I was just excited to be there. Um,
Yeah.
and they were like, "Oh, it's this." And I looked, I was like, "Okay, so wait, that's $3,300 for the entire year." And they were like, "Yeah." And I was like, "Whoa, okay, like that changes things. Like now I got to go home in the off season and train. Like I'm gonna have to get other jobs. I'm gonna have
Yeah.
to, like, how am I gonna pay for this? Even just rent or food or whatever, right?" So it was like immediately the wheel started to turn about, like,
Yeah.
this is a real job. You know what I mean? This
Yeah.
isn't
Right.
reality set in really, really quick. So I played for the Diamondbacks. I played for the Orioles. I ended up playing 3 seasons in the minor leagues. All
Mhm.
the while, I was like, I was not a prospect. I mean, it performed well, but wasn't at the top of the prospect list. So kind of knew that I needed to be thinking about the next thing, probably more so
Mhm.
than the average player does. And so in the off seasons, I had actually studied for the LSAT, took the LSAT, which is something during college I thought about was going to law school. And so
Mhm.
um, I applied to law school and ended up getting released in 2014 by the Orioles. And at that point, I had been admitted to law schools, but had like deferred
Yeah.
um, at UVA, and where we met. And so I ended up, basically calling up the admissions folks at UVA and saying, "You don't need to defer me. I'm going to come in the fall." And so played indie ball, minor league baseball that summer, um, and really went into the manager's office like 3 days before orientation was going to start and said, like, "Hey, I need my release because I'm going to law school on Monday." And he thought I was kidding, and
Mhm.
I was like, "No, seriously, like I need my release. I'm going driving driving to Virginia to go to law school." And yeah, so it was a quick transition, like really from playing right into law school, and um, you know, went down that path, enjoyed law school,
Mhm.
and then went clerked for a district court judge in Baltimore, clerked for a circuit court judge in DC, and then went for a year to Williams and Connolly in DC, where I was practicing, um, and did, really I was in like the appellate and Supreme Court practice, but I did like one sports case, and that was like I was like, I need to get back into my passion over here.
Let me pause you just 1 second here, just so people understand.
Sure.
You were a very good law student, especially as I recall after your first year, kinda but you
I feel you're accusing. This feels like an accusation, but okay.
no, you're a very good law student, and, to get those clerkships, especially the DC Circuit clerkship, that's a very big deal for a law student, and then to then work at Williams& Connolly, that's one of the most selective firms, in the most selective market in the country. It's a very, very big deal, and if people are following, what's happening to law firms right now, they will see Williams& Connolly in the news because I think Williams& Connolly is currently representing Perkins Coie.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
Um, yeah, okay. Anyway, just
No,
wanted to
well,
make
well,
sure people or
yeah, yeah. Look,
wanted
I,
to
I
make sure people
appreciate it.
understood that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, and look, it was. I really enjoyed practicing law, right? So this was an
Yeah.
interesting thing. Like I enjoyed law school, I really enjoyed practicing law, but it was from an angle of wanting to tangibly help people and like do things that were going to have an impact, right? So like
Yeah.
the sort of academic side of it was always interesting, and the reading and writing and oral advocacy, but like ultimately I was like, how is this going to help people live better lives? Like that's what always motivated me, and that was why I was drawn to kind of the Supreme Court appellate practice, because I thought, all right, these are big cases that have like, serious implications for people's lives. So
Yeah.
um, like that was kind of the draw. And I pretty quickly realized when you're around the best of the best at something, as I was in the practice there at Williams Connolly. If you're good at something, but it's not like your thing, you can realize that pretty quickly. And I think I
Yeah.
realized that pretty quickly. And as I said, I did a sports case with Mark Levinstein. I felt like, oh, this is more like this is like what I'm really passionate about. And then it was really, I hadn't been at the firm for that long when this organization, Advocates for Minor Leaguers, formed. And it was, publicized. It was like on ESPN.com. And I, like, many people would sit there on my, lunch and eat lunch and like reading ESPN.com or whatever. And I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
this Advocates for Minor Leaguers, like this is really up my alley. What are they doing? I've always been passionate about the mistreatment of minor leaguers. I've written my law school admissions essay about the mistreatment of minor league players, particularly Latin American players. So I was like, this is, um, you know, and you and I have talked about this, but I'm also a pretty, faith-based person, Catholic, and
Yeah.
like go to daily mass and the whole nine. And I felt like a sense of vocation kind of, appearing sort of to me in that moment of like, you kind of are on the one hand seeing that this isn't the path, and on the other hand, you're seeing that this is being kind of presented to you. And so
Mhm.
I ended up leaving the firm to go. At the time, the organization didn't have any funding at all. But I just kind of took a leap of faith, and I'm very fortunate to have a supportive spouse who thought that was a good idea, Caitlin. And I started basically just volunteering, and then within
Mhm.
6 months, we got the first money in the door, and at that point, I became the executive director of this organization, Advocates for Minor Leaguers, and that's where the real path of labor organizing and advocacy in sports really began for me, 5 years ago at this point.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, just to get a sense of the timeline. So, this is now. Are we now looking at this like 2020, 2021?
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. So yeah,
Great.
left the firm in 2020 and formally became the executive director of Advocates for Minor Leaguers in early 21.
Okay. And so now you're at Advocates for Minor Leaguers. Uh, what do you actually do? How do you get in contact with people? What does advocating for a group look like? What does collective action look like?
Yeah. So it was really interesting because when we started, this wasn't like, hey, let's go form a union, or hey, let's do this or let's do that. It was just like, hey, the conditions for these players are really poor. Like as I said,
Yep.
$3,000 a year, guys are living 6 or 7 to a one-bedroom apartment, people are eating fast food and peanut butter and jelly for every meal. Like, this is not right. Let's make
Hmm.
it better. That was really the,
Yeah.
the whole charge. And I
Hmm.
didn't have like a union um background. I wasn't like a labor lawyer, right? It wasn't like I had a sort of predisposition to say organizing and forming a union is the path. It was really just that I just kind of came in and did an analysis of, well, why are the players treated this poorly? Like, if
Yeah.
we're going to solve a problem, let's understand it first. And what I realized was essentially there were two reasons. One was baseball has this historically anomalous antitrust exemption, right? That's
Yep.
basically completely unique, where teams can collude on player treatment in a way that competitors in other industries can't. So they could just set the standard contract at $3,000 a year or $10,000 a year, or
Right.
whatever they wanted, and that would plainly be illegal if Burger King and McDonald's and Taco Bell and all the fast food restaurants got together and said, "This is it, and we're all going to agree. This is all we're going to pay
Yeah.
people." Um, and or if law firms did or whatever, it's just you can't do it. You can't collude like that, but you could in baseball. So that was one thing. And then the other was that unlike most other sports, baseball, minor league baseball players didn't have a players association, didn't have a collective bargaining agreement. And so when I sat down to kind of assess like how are we going to address this, um, it was really we had to do one of two things. Either we needed to force a repeal of baseball's antitrust exemption so that teams would have to compete for players, or the players were going to have to unionize and get that kind of a collective bargaining agreement in place to have collective power to negotiate their contracts together. Because as a group, any individual minor league player, sure, we'll just toss them overboard and replace them. Lots of people want to be minor league players, but
Hmm.
the system doesn't go without minor leaguers. So if everyone gets together and says, no, 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 you're not going to have any minor league system unless you pay all of us
Right.
more, which essentially the union is, then we can move the needle. So, you know, over the next couple of years, we did pursue both kind of simultaneously strategically. So we organized, when you start to organize a union, you're really just talking to people, right? Like that's it. It's like
Mhm.
reaching out and talking to people. So I literally, I mean, to answer your question, I mean, it was at the beginning, it was just me. So I literally sent Instagram DMs to every single minor league baseball player that I could find, like 4 or 5 thousand of them. Yeah,
Did you have, like, a standard message where it's like, "Okay,
oh yeah, yeah.
this is pretty
And
good, type that out."
like, and you can only send like you basically can't send more than like if you send too many, you have to like get your cadence right. If you send too many, it'll lock your account. So that would happen.
Ah,
So like, but if you send like one a minute, you can kind of keep it going. And so, yeah, I learned the ins and outs of the blind DM to folks. And I was joking with someone the other day that I think it's stopped by now, but I was still getting like responses to people who were like clearly like finding like some folder that this was, hidden in like 3 years later. And they're like, hey, like, good job, by the way. Glad we got this done.
yeah,
Message that was sent in 2021. Um, but yeah, so that was it. I mean, we built an organizing committee
yeah,
um, just by starting with blind outreach, seeing who responded, turning those into phone calls. Once you had enough guys kind of, on the phone, getting to a Zoom call where you had a group. I mean, I think our first Zoom call had like 8 players. And then you kind of build and build and build till, you know, over the course of 2 years, we had thousands of players signing petitions. Um, but organizing is really, really hard. We talk about it. It's really, really, really time intensive and really
yeah,
tedious work, and repetitive work, and just really challenging. You're just kind of getting people to see their situation differently and then take action um, as a group, right? And it's not easy.
yeah.
So anyway, yeah, go ahead.
And while this is happening, while you're sending out the thousands of DMs, are you kinda boning up on labor law, try to get an idea of how this actually works, legally?
Sure.
At what point did it so you're pursuing both these paths simultaneously, this idea, of, uh, getting rid of or limiting MLB's antitrust exemption, and then on the other side, forming a union, you know, eh I haven't thought as much about the going after the antitrust exemption part,
Yeah.
what did that look like?
Yeah.
What did you do?
Yeah, I mean, look, so the short answer to the first part of your question is yes, definitely got the labor law, primer and talked to all different people and sort of got, an understanding of that. And that's like a conversation for maybe another day or later. But
Mhm.
the need for labor law reform in the country is real, right? I mean, the labor laws are not in a great spot. But so
Mm.
got, up to speed on that. But um from an antitrust perspective, really that was politics, right? So it
Yeah.
was a lobbying effort. So we went to Capitol Hill and we actually successfully took a lot of meetings and a lot of lobbying. And we had a former presidential campaign manager who was helping out. Um, and we went and we just met with folks, bipartisan senators, and we actually successfully got the Senate Judiciary Committee to open an inquiry into baseball's antitrust exemption. Now, this had happened over the years from time
Mhm.
to time, but what was interesting about it was we had, I think it was Durbin, Blumenthal, Grassley, and Lee on the same letter. So we had like, two and two from different sides of the aisle.
Mhm.
Um, and the focus was the mistreatment of minor leaguers and that this antitrust exemption was enabling it.
Mhm.
And you can go back and look, there was a fun little, you know, I had a, yeah, I had a letter, Manfred had a letter. We kind of had like a back and forth before the Senate Judiciary Committee in writing. And
Mhm.
then there was a hearing that was scheduled at a certain point once we realized that the labor um, organizing was going to be successful, right? That we had the
Mhm.
numbers to actually form the union. We kind of flipped and the antitrust became leverage instead of an aim in and of itself. Because what we realized
Yeah.
is that MLB actually wanted this exemption for more than just the treatment of the mistreatment of
Yeah.
minor leaguers. Even if they were gonna have to treat the minor leaguers better, they wanted to keep the exemption, right?
Mhm.
And so they didn't want to let this be the sort of the thing that got in there and caused them to lose their exemption. And
Right.
so what we did was this was, I guess August of 2022, basically merged our nonprofit advocates for minor leaguers into the MLBPA so that they could take on the actual union drive and put out the union cards under um, that umbrella, which was always the goal.
Mhm.
Then we, at that point, had a hearing that had been scheduled for a few weeks later where I was going to testify, Manfred was going to testify, the commissioner, Major League Baseball, and a handful of other people about repealing baseball's antitrust exemption. So when we passed the cards over to MLB, the senators, and I can't remember which one it was, I think it was one of the Republicans, called over to the league office and said, hey, by the way, if you voluntarily recognize them instead of fighting this and forcing it to an election, we'll pull down that hearing on the antitrust thing. And so
Mhm.
then the next, within an hour, we got a call from MLB saying, okay, we're going to voluntarily recognize this union and have the antitrust thing go away. So it ended up being really important to the
Yeah.
overall strategy.
Right.
And that part never really was, it never really got made public because it was kind of all a behind the scenes thing, but it was
Yeah.
super, super interesting. And it was interesting to see the way we were able to get sort of bipartisan support um, for that effort at the time.
Mhm. What did it feel like when you got that call?
Oh, I mean, the whole experience of organizing the minor leaguers was I don't think I'll have a cooler experience because it was so personal to me, and
Yeah.
it's one of those things where I feel like so many people played um, such a big role in making it happen. So it was like such a big team effort, and the odds were so long. And so many
Yeah.
people said this can never be done, right? Like 6,000 players, 150 teams, half of them speak Spanish as a first language. Like it's just never going to happen. And so when it happened, it was a very, very good feeling, very rewarding,
Mhm.
and really one that I come back to a lot, I think, because when you see something like that happen, at least for me, it definitely makes you believe, okay, we can do this again. We can
Hmm.
scale that mountain again. Um, and the first time around, you're kind of doing it on blind faith. You just have this irrational
Right.
passion and belief, hey, we're going to do this. But once you've seen it happen, it really instills the confidence that attack another problem. And even if people say this can't be done, um, why not? We just did it over here. So I think, that feeling of the joint accomplishment that all these people had, primarily the players who actually took on a lot of risk by being part of the organizing committee and sticking their necks out and getting up in front of their teams and saying, hey, let's join this union, knowing that like that information was going up to the front office. Like they all knew who
Mhm.
was the guy
Yeah.
or the guys who were getting up there kind of saying that. Just really a rewarding thing to be a part of, you know, as rewarding as anything I've been a part of for sure.
Can you what are the conditions like for minor leagues? I'm sure, they're not getting rich, but the
Yeah.
money situation did change pretty dramatically and yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, so the way it works is once we got the voluntary recognition of the union, meaning, the league would recognize us and deal with us and bargain with us, then we had to actually negotiate a collective bargaining agreement, which is
Mhm.
itself, a difficult process often. There, because we had spent a couple years organizing and it had been a real fight on the front end, and they were agreeing to recognize us, it was less difficult in terms of how contentious it was than some other, CBA negotiation. But,
Mhm.
over the course of 5 months, we negotiated, I think it was 250 page CBA that really transformed the working conditions for the players. So, um, yeah, guys are still not getting rich, but basically tripled pay for all the players, got players free housing, free meals, free transportation, better health and retirement benefits. For the first time, there was a grievance procedure for discipline where there's a just cause standard, which is super important, meaning, previously the league could just discipline um, players and not really have to have any justification. So,
Mhm.
it really was transformational across the board. Obviously, the pay, tripling pay, anytime you triple someone's pay, that's going to be the headliner, and rightfully so. But it was broader than that, and it really, um, I think, just fundamentally sort of changed what it meant to be a minor league player. Where okay, now they're being treated like professional athletes. They're still not going to get rich.
Mhm.
Um, but this is something guys can be proud to do. They're not, sleeping on air mattresses and, working 3 jobs and guys sleeping in their car and some of the crazy conditions that we were dealing with when we started the organizing campaign.
Yeah, man, that's really cool. So, to give the listeners a little more background. So, I have one cousin who's now in the major leagues, and his younger brother's in the minors with twins. And so, my cousin, Oliver Dunn, that plays for the Brewers, he was in the minors at the time. And I mean, yeah, you're right. The conditions are that. they were, kind of nuts, where the players aren't just, rooming together with, maybe 2, 4, 5 guys during the season. It's like off season. Where are they getting money? Some of the guys come from money, so that's great. They can stay, with their parents or whatever. They'll set them up near, near their trainers or whatever, wherever they need to be. But a lot of the guys, it's actually funny. Mitch Spence, who is a starting pitcher for the A's, I was about to say Oakland A's, R.I.P. Oakland, part of that, but
RIP, yeah,
yeah,
RIP.
but great guy who now in like literally until he made it to the majors was working throughout the whole offseason. He's from rural part of North Carolina. He was working, I can't remember if it was at Target, Walmart, Home Depot, like one of the big box sort of places. This guy, yeah, like he's on the cusp of making it to the majors. And here he is the whole offseason. You have this in your head, you have this idea that professional athletes, to the extent they're not already rich, they're like really working on their craft. And it's not like he wasn't training, but he was also working pretty much full time at like Target, you know, and
Totally.
it's
Not uncommon. Not uncommon, which is crazy.
yeah, and just wild. So I like part of this, like I'm grateful on a personal level for all this sort of stuff to see the conditions that changed for my family, and now to see, that like the money now, especially once you get up to the higher levels of the minor leagues, actually is pretty, it's sustainable. It's something where you can really give it a shot, and even if you don't come from money, you can see if you know you might have what it takes to make that final step up to the majors where the money is very good. um
Yeah, I mean, and let me say one last thing, which is
yeah,
a lot of players had to give up after a few years, which was really unfortunate, who had major league talent because they couldn't do it at a certain
right,
point. They just didn't have the ability. They had they were married or they had a kid or they had responsibilities. They didn't have any, opportunity to get any kind of outside support. And after, 3 seasons or whatever, they were like, I can't keep doing this. And I think in the new sort of minor league system, that won't happen, which is great. Like guys won't be
yeah,
giving up because they just can't make ends meet. So it's unfortunate for guys in the past who weren't able to make it to the major leagues because of that, but hopefully that won't happen moving forward.
yeah. That's funny. That's one thing that I think people don't really realize watching professional sports, but especially with baseball. I mean, with any sport, but especially with baseball, where you have this very long track, to the highest level. Like guys do not develop at the same level, or sorry, at the same rate. They develop at different points, and there are plenty of guys who kind of just hang on, lower levels of minor, and then just figure something out, whether it's mental, whether it's mechanical, whatever, and then just explode. And there are dozens, hundreds of examples of guys, who scouts thought weren't going to be any good and then ended up being great, and not immediately, but like, eventually. Um,
Yeah.
okay. So you get through that, you get the CBA signed. You still not, at what point did sports solidarity become a thing?
Yeah. So really, as soon as we got the CBA signed and it became public in all these, sports outlets and whatnot, that all those wins had been sort of achieved and tripling pay and stuff, perhaps not surprisingly, started to get outreach from different folks in across sort of the sports ecosystem, so to speak, who were interested in organizing, right? So people who were like, it's a variation of questions and a variation of different, folks from different groups, but it was either like, hey, can you help our group, or can you point us in the direction of someone who can help our group, or how did you do this, or what resources are there out there to do this, if we wanted to start something similar to advocates for minor leaguers. So I got probably a dozen or so of those types of inquiries over the course of, I don't know, the first few months after reaching agreement
Hmm.
on the CBA. And, my first instinct was to kind of point people and find a direction to point them in, right? And what I realized pretty quickly was there just wasn't anywhere to point folks, right? Um, the the major sports unions were very focused on servicing their members. They just didn't have like a big new organizing. A lot of established labor unions have like organizing departments. The sports unions
Mm.
don't have that, right? So there's no kind of new organizing energy in those sports unions. And there wasn't really anyone out there trying to organize people in sports in a real way. And so it really was as simple as just building something to meet the demand. I mean, I started to talk to people I trust and say, hey, like we learned a lot. Obviously, we had this success that we can kind of build on with the minor league players. There's all these other groups that also need a union, also need this kind of representation. What if we kind of built something new that was broader, that went out and kind of tried to organize and support all of the folks across sports who don't have representation right now, and we used everything we learned from the minor league campaign, the things we did well, we replicate the things we would do differently, we do differently, and we see if we can scale this thing. And so, um, I think maybe it's part of my personality, that like looking for the next challenge type of a thing. But it was like, this is right in front of us and people are asking for help. And I feel like I can, maybe build something that can help them. And
Mhm.
now's as good a time as any to use the momentum and see what we can do.
So what has that been like, as you do try to help these other groups? I would
Yeah.
imagine that probably some of what you are doing is not public right now and shouldn't be public. Is there anything
Mhm.
that you can talk about?
Yeah. So that's right. A lot of it is not public because, and I think you appreciate this, but for any listeners like the who don't, labor organizing is not usually very well received by the employer, and if they get news, get news of that early on before
Oh,
you're kind of
good.
really.
Yeah.
Yeah, right, right. Oh, that's great. We're so excited to work with this union and pay them more money and treat them better. So the um, so you try to keep it quiet, right, for a time.
Yeah.
So we're working on, basically we have a great team. Really excited about the team we've built. We have Josh Tolley, who was with me, who's a longtime major leaguer, who was really instrumental in the baseball campaign, is our organizing director. Joe Calvello used to be um, the comms director for Senator Fetterman. He's our comms director. David Foster was at the NBPA for 10 years, was the head of the G League Union. He's our general counsel. So we built out a
Mhm.
really strong leadership team. Um, with really relevant experience and a bunch of other former athlete organizers with similarly impressive and exciting backgrounds. So we have a good team of about 10 people, um, and we've started some campaigns. The biggest thing that is public that we're doing right now, like is when I get off this call, trying to really get it done, is negotiating a collective bargaining agreement for the United Football League
Mm.
players. So the XFL spring football, basically, minor league football, has gone through a lot of different changes over the years. But there was the USFL back in the '80s, and then reincarnation in the last few years of the USFL, and then the XFL,
Mhm.
and then a couple years ago the XFL and the USFL merged,
Mhm.
and so into this United Football League. And the games are on, actually, just the first week was this last weekend, and the games are on ESPN and Fox and ABC. They're all nationally televised. Um, a lot of guys with former NFL experience, and guys trying to get back. And so we've been working on that collective bargaining agreement for that union, which had formed but hadn't they came to us to actually try to negotiate the agreement once they
Mm.
formed.
Mhm.
So we started maybe in November, and it's been a very contentious negotiation, and we've had to fight and scratch for everything. But we're getting there, I think, to get it resolved. So that's been
Nice.
a big part of the work here over the last 6 months.
And so that sticks in people's minds. So Dwayne the Rock Johnson is involved with the UFL in one respect. What is his role with the UFL exactly? Can we say that?
Yes. Yeah, yeah, no, he's one of the owners, really, right? So
Okay.
it's basically it's Dwayne, it's his ex-wife,
Mm.
Danny Garcia,
Yeah.
it's the folks at Redbird Capital and Fox. They're the four owners of the league.
Nice. Well, okay. Well, we'll leave that right there. But good luck. The
See.
I want to. So okay. So the world of sports is very unique. You talked about the antitrust exemption for baseball. Like, there's similar situations. I believe for the other leagues. I'm not quite as familiar, but it's a to put this kind of concretely, like in baseball, ignore the antitrust exemption, whatever legal regime enables this for a second. But the way to look at it is that you have, a set of teams. So you have this set of employers that are all allowed to, talk together, included, on uh, the wages and everything like that. And then also there's no employee freedom. Like if you're playing for the Blue Jays, you can't just say, you know what, I don't like this. I'm not getting playing time, or I don't like Vladimir Guerrero Jr. Like I'm going to go play for the Orioles. Can't do that. And so that is, an obvious situation where, when the employee's freedom is that restricted, it makes sense for them to band together and bargain collectively. There are a lot of other industries where that is not the case, or where that basic situation is a little different. Um, so what basically how do you feel about labor organizing outside the sports context?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm like I said, five years ago when I got into this, it was very much from a place of my personal experience and just experiencing these conditions and thinking they needed to improve without really any kind of a preconception about, what the best way to do that was. I think what
Yeah.
I've learned in the last 5 years is the power of labor unions more generally, right? In sports and beyond, and collective bargaining, I think, in sports and beyond. So, I think it's really important from a number of angles. One is, so obviously, in any context, whether or not the employer is part of a monopoly, um, there's an imbalance of power between an employer and an employee, right?
Yeah.
That's just the nature of one person is in charge and the other isn't, right? So
Like one
there's
guy can fire the other, and yeah.
that's it, right? Like, so this is not a relationship of equals. So there is the balancing of power that it creates, and the fair outcomes that flow from that. Um, I think that's true across any employer, and that's a good thing. But to me, I think that's sort of the more obvious thing, right? Is like, okay, it's going to drive up wages and improve working conditions for working people, and it's going to ensure that they don't get taken advantage of, and that the people who are in charge, the employers, don't unilaterally decide to take too much of the cut for themselves, right? Because that's the
Mm,
risk, and that's frankly what happens. It's human nature, unfortunately, for a lot of people. So I think that's like the obvious reason why it's good, right? Is it just improves the lives of working people. And the reality is the vast majority of American people are working people. And if you look at the outcomes for working people across the country, they're not good enough, right? Like,
mhm.
it's gotten harder and harder for working people over the last 50 years in this country. And I think unions are as good of a way as any to improve those outcomes, just in terms of basic ability to afford a life and support your family. Um, Now, the other parts of forming a union and being a part of a union that I also really believe in, that I would have been less obvious to me, I think, at the beginning of this journey, is really the power of having a voice on the job. I think it's just really important. Like, I watched the way that um, getting involved in the union organizing effort empowered players and made them feel differently about themselves, their teammates, the workplace. Like, I think that was really powerful. That sense of belonging to a collective group to which you owe responsibilities and have some level of ownership and autonomy over your own daily life. Um, and I think so that's another thing. And I think that sort of the third thing that immediately comes to my mind is just democracy in the workplace. I think it just shows people, like, in a really tangible way that's closer to home than like national level electoral politics, what democracy is supposed to be, right? Like, this idea that,
Hmm.
you know, you like, unions are democracies. That's how they work, right? So like, when you go to do collective bargaining, you host a call like this with a bunch of people on it, and you say, hey, we're going to make this proposal, and then there's a robust exchange of ideas, and ultimately, if it's done right, it's kind of the majority wins, right? Like that's how unions operate. They're fundamentally democratic bodies. And so having democracy in the workplace and seeing how that works, I think is really a powerful force more generally, especially at a time when I think the very nature of democracy is somewhat under attack, right? I mean, I think that there's
Yeah.
definitely some things that a lot of people, myself included, would have taken for granted 10, 15 years ago about, the way the American people just feel about institutions and democratic institutions and the way to achieve the best results, I think are a little more in question than they have been. So I think
Mhm.
um, they're really well suited to the time, right? Like more generally,
Mhm.
because I think working people are doing really poorly. I think democracy, as such, is doing more poorly than it has been in the past, and I think unions are a really good way of addressing both of those things more generally and really underutilized. And I think in the past when those things have been better, right? When commitment to democracy writ large, I think has been better, and when working people have been doing better, you go back a generation or two ago to times when union density were a lot higher. Right now, it's really low, less than like
Yeah.
10%
Yeah.
in the private sector. Most people just are not super familiar with unions. They're far from ubiquitous. I mean, they're really pretty rare, unfortunately, at this point.
Yeah. So yeah, I think the numbers that you like at the peak level of union membership in the 50s or 60s, it was over 20% in the private sector. Over 20% of American workers were in a union. Now it's 10% or below.
Mhm.
One of the so traditionally, the two parties have kind of stood on opposite sides of the issue, where the Democratic Party pro union, pro labor, and that's in the organized sense, and then on the Republican side, you have right to work laws, which so I'm speaking to you from the great state of Utah, which does have right to work laws. I'm not sure if uh, Virginia does, but the basic premise is that even if you do have a unionized workforce, any individual employee cannot be forced to be part of that union, and they can still work at that for that employer despite not being part of the union. Um, you're seeing, on the right, and it's interesting to talk about kind of skepticism of democracy generally, but you also see skepticism of these Republican dogmas of the last 40, 50, 60 years that arguably led us to this situation, where there are a lot of jobs that were formerly uh, union jobs, high paying, manufacturing jobs, that sort of thing, and where those jobs are no longer in the United States. Um, do you, how do you feel, looking broadly, at the, like, what do you see as the future of labor right now, the future of unions?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think so. I do think there's a reevaluation of on the right of among some people on the right of the need to be more pro worker. Now,
Hmm.
whether that's ends up being pro union or pro union as currently constituted, I think is a different question, right? I'm less optimistic about that than I am about this general understanding that like speaking to workers and to working um, class issues very directly, right,
Yeah,
is
right.
important. I mean, I think that it's very clear to me, at least, that economic populism is the path forward more generally, right? Like when you look at the situation that the country's in and how poorly, I mean, like, the income inequality, this has been obvious to me for since I was in college 15 plus years ago, is that, the fundamental issue of our time is income inequality, right? Because, and we
Hmm.
could talk about all the reasons that that's gotten to be the way it has, but in my view, income inequality is it's just increasing, 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 and it's really, really bad for society. And you see Elon Musk, it's not a coincidence that you literally have like the richest man in the country is just like literally standing next to the president, like his puppet. It's that it's almost like this visual embodiment of this income inequality taken
Hmm.
to sort of an extreme level, right? In
Hmm.
terms of the fact that when you think about it's not just about dollars and cents. It's also about power and about democracy and about the functioning of our political system. And so, like in law school, when I wrote the law review article, it was about Citizens United and why that was such a
Mm,
poor
mm,
decision. And so and the reason I think is when you have money buying political institutions, and we're seeing this, we talked earlier about law firms a little bit before the show. I mean, like what's happening there, right? Like we're seeing really concretely the way that, the intertwining of sort of money and politics is getting crazier and crazier by the day. And unfortunately, what that leads to is just cementing this gulf between the haves and the have-nots, and really
mhm,
disempowering the vast majority of people who are working class people who really just want to, at the end of the day, like support their families and live a life with dignity. And like most people are willing to put in the work and
mhm,
do those things, right? Show up, do a good job, go home, take care of their families, have some hobbies and whatnot on the weekend. Like that's the life that most people want. It's becoming harder and harder to achieve for a lot of people at the same time that more and more of, there's a larger and larger percentage and number of people that have just like this gross ridiculous amount of money and the power that comes with it. And so to me, like that's that's the lens through which I see a lot of what's going on more
mhm,
generally. And I think the reason that in the face of a candidate who's, I think, very flawed, although I understand why some people are attracted to him in Trump. The reason why he still won was I think the Democratic Party just didn't see. They saw the world through a different lens, right? Which was much more about taking people, putting them in different groups, and really focusing on identity. And I think
mhm,
that while I totally understand the historical reasons why that's the case and why a lot of those issues are super important, I think taking that approach was it kind of missed the moment and missed kind of where
mm,
where things are at a broader level, which I think is way more about the economy. And so I think labor unions are a really important part of this next chapter in America more generally, because I think there's a real question right now of, are unions going to become a vehicle for rectifying some of what's gone wrong in terms of income inequality and the way the country's going, or not, and or are they going to kind of continue to go down sort of like further into irrelevance? um,
mhm,
and so I think there's a huge opportunity for unions to sort of separate out from a lot of to be less tied into the Democratic Party as such, Democratic establishment as such, identity politics as such, what have you, and just really refocus on a much more very like meat and potatoes economic populist message, which is like working class people should be able to make a living wage and support their families, and we shouldn't allow a system in which the people who own these companies are have more money than they can ever spend in a million. Like it's just, on some level, it's common sense. It's right. Like that's not an efficient allocation of money to
mhm.
give all this money to a few people who can't even spend it while other people could use it and
Yeah.
really live better lives. And I think if unions can, I think they're as well positioned, is what I'm trying to say, as any institution to deliver that message, right? And to
Yeah.
say, hey, this is what we should be focused on. But that's going to take a little bit of a reorientation, I think, in terms of how unions think about themselves, and sort of obviously from a leadership perspective that hasn't necessarily. Some people have articulated that really well, but I think that um, to me, to answer your question of like where does it go, I think it depends a lot on whether unions can see that opportunity and reconstitute themselves as fundamentally about this sort of these economic issues and just really hammering the main thing. And I think if
Mhm,
they can, a lot of people will be attracted to it. And I think they can have a lot of relevance with both political parties. I think if they don't, and they just become or sort of continue to be a sort of increasingly powerless appendage to the Democratic Party,
mhm,
they can still do a lot of really important work in those workplaces where they exist, as I've talked about, and for their members. But like in terms of as a national political force, there's not going to be a sort of a reemergence of them unless they sort of recognize the moment, I think. So I'm interested to see where it goes.
Yeah. No, that's a great answer, and I had a number of thoughts that came to mind while you were, speaking, and I know we're gonna end in just, like, 2 minutes,
Okay.
but yeah, fundamentally, this comes down to the power imbalance between employer and employee, and the fact that, the interests of the employee and the interests of the employer are aligned in certain respects, but are not aligned in others. Money that goes to the employer and stays with the employer has not gone to the employees. Money that goes to the employees has not gone to the employers. And we've seen this over the years. Like, what do we see employers do? We see them ship jobs to places where they can pay workers less. We see them try to automate. So you don't have as many workers. When management consultants come in, often they're looking to uh, reduce inefficiencies and all that sort of stuff, which usually just means firing some workers. And when private equity companies come in and funds come in, they buy companies. They're looking to eliminate those inefficiencies. You're getting rid of employees. When public companies merge, same outcome. You're looking for synergies, and synergies typically mean that you can use fewer workers to do the same thing. And I think, coming from a background in the law, it's a unique industry in at least one respect, I think, in that you have a huge number of employers doing fundamentally the exact same work in the same geographic area. So if, like, I worked at Skadden in New York City, and if you work at Skadden in New York City, there's not just one firm you can work at. There's like 150 you could work at without moving. You can stay in the exact same spot and then go work at Paul Weiss, Kirkland, Freshfields, wherever. And that structure there. Oh, and then the employers are competing for a limited number of qualified applicants. Especially once you get a couple of years in and people start to get some experience. And what you see is that, like, in certain respects, that gives big law associates union-esque benefits. Like, if one firm raises salaries, you see every firm
Mhm.
raise salaries. So that like, you work at Skadden, you go to Kirkland. Actually, Kirkland, you might make a little bit more, but most firms, you're going to make the exact same amount of money. It's because all of them are matching each other, because if they don't, they can't recruit. um, that situation doesn't exist hardly anywhere else. The companies I've represented, you're representing a company that is based in suburbia, and if its employees get fired, they have to do something else entirely. They might need to move, like, they just don't have the same sort of options. And so, that's where, if it's not a union, it's funny. I talk to a lot of people who are, coming at things from the right, and they are uh, either reflexively anti-union or very thoughtfully anti-union. But what they can never really answer, is, if you're just an ordinary rank and file employee, and you're not, like, a gunner who's going to work 20 hours a day and weekends so you can quickly get to management and be the fat cat at the top that's getting all the money. Like, if you just, want to live a normal working life, working 9 to 5, and be able to afford a vacation once a year to Disney World or wherever, and all that, like, why wouldn't you join the union? Like, to me, it seems like it's I don't know. At the law firm, sorry, I
Yeah.
I used to tell more junior associates, like, listen, okay, and with love for the firm, and there are people from Skadden that will listen to us. I had a great time at Skadden. Loved Skadden. It's great. But as an associate, you got to understand, the firm does not care about you. They
No.
do not care about you. And it is to your advantage to never forget that. There are individual people that care about you, but the firm writ large, it's like the relationship is a little bit adverse. So, don't do anything you're not getting paid for. And if you feel like you're not being, treated right, then, your recourse when you're at a law firm, go to another firm. But in other situations where that isn't, where that same possibility isn't there, you start to look at organizing efforts, I think.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think I'll say this for people, and I understand there's a long history, and unions have not always comported themselves well or used the trust that they have, from workers well, and there's a long history of corruption, all the above, right? So I think like the reasons why people might be anti-union reflexively and where it's fit in the political system, I get it. But I'd say this: at the end of the day, there's no there's no mechanism through which unions, just by virtue of collective bargaining, can really get more than their fair share for the workers, right? Because at the end of the day, you can't force an employer. This is just one of the fundamental tenets of collective bargaining, is you can't force an employer to stay in business if they don't want to stay in business anymore. So by definition, that sort of backstop means you're by collective bargaining, you're going to get something closer and closer to really your fair share. At a certain point,
Mhm.
if it's more than your fair share and it just doesn't make sense anymore for the employer, well, they don't have to agree to that, right? Because they have this in the background,
Mhm.
is like they're still ultimately in charge, and there's nothing that the labor law does to say, no, you have to keep running this business and you pay them whatever. So to me, again, I think a lot of the way that unions have operated, I get it in terms of people being anti-union and all of that, and just the way that it's sort of been overly partisan. Historically, I get it, but if you really get back to like what it is in terms of a voice in the workplace and an ability to band together to just have one single representative more efficiently sort of figure out what the fair share is for all the workers, um, I think it's hard to make a really compelling case against it in almost any context. And I'm hopeful that in the future, there will be a sort of a generation of union leaders that can articulate that message, that can sort of make the main thing, um, for unions, because I think there's a lot of promise there if it happens, and I
Yeah.
think a lot of the troubles that we see can be solved by having a more powerful and effective and focused labor movement. Whether it
Mhm.
will happen, TBD. But I hope that the people who listen to this, who come at it from a different angle, have, and this is why I read the stuff that you do and listen and think it's really cool, is hopefully people are willing to reevaluate and think about, okay, what if unions were done maybe a little differently or a little better, and think about some of the fundamentals of what really happens via collective bargaining and collective representation, and really, ask maybe whether that would be a solution to some of the things we're seeing, um, right now that are suboptimal. So we'll
I
see.
I
That's my
I
hope.
love the way you reframe that. It's like so, ultimately it's the employer's choice to stay in business. So the way it's framed from the other side is that, well, if the employee doesn't like the way they're being treated, they can leave. That's true. But it the why the fact that it's framed that way is a political choice. Why not frame it the other way? Go from employer centered to worker centered, and that's what you're doing. And so, there are a lot of people that are going to disagree, and I politically am aligned with you, which kind of makes this fun. Um, but anyway, I think what you're doing is awesome. I really appreciate you coming on. Uh, Fun to talk to you. And a
Yeah.
lot of good stuff there, and hopefully people, really really engage with it. The people that are already aligned with it are, more and more stoked about it, and the people that aren't really think about it.
Well, I appreciate you having me on, and I love what you're doing with this, and yeah, thanks for a good conversation.
All right, and that was the interview. Thank you very much for listening. If you wouldn't mind, please do leave a review for the podcast. I believe those are important. And subscribe to the newsletter, which will be linked in the show notes or can be found at neverclosetheinquiry.substack.com. Thanks.